Thank you. My name is Jason Selvig, and I'm from West Palm Beach, Florida. And I would like to say that I am sick and tired of the left-wing media, and frankly, people in this room today, spreading misinformation about Wayne LaPierre. Whenever there's a mass shooting, they all say that Wayne LaPierre isn't doing enough to stop these mass shootings, and even implying that Wayne LaPierre has played a part in making it easier for these shooters to get guns, to get weapons. You heard it after Las Vegas. You heard it after Pulse nightclub in Orlando. You heard it after Columbine. You heard it after Parkland. You heard it after Virginia Tech. You heard it after Sandy Hook. You heard it after El Paso. You heard it after Buffalo. You kept hearing that Wayne LaPierre isn't doing enough, and frankly, that's not true. The NRA, under Wayne LaPierre's leadership, has provided thoughts and prayers to the victims and their families. And maybe these mass shootings would stop happening if we all thought a little bit more and we prayed a little bit more. So I'm asking everyone in this room to think, to pray. Give your thoughts and your prayers and your thoughts and your prayers and your prayers and your thoughts. And if we give enough of these thoughts and these prayers, these mass shootings will stop. So I want to thank you, Wayne LaPierre, for all your thoughts and all your prayers. Thank you.
So after digesting a bit from last week's episode and I'd say putting not only thoughts into place, but actually kind of figuring out what it was that bothered me so much. One of the primary bites that I want to call attention to this week is how to get engaged. As the clip alluded to, like at this point, thoughts and prayers are well beyond any kind of response to shootings in the United States. Something has to be done. And after our episode last week, I at least looked at a couple of high-level things that I could do to try to start the ball rolling. And it certainly is not enough. I don't want to say stop here. But if, for those people who might listen and want to know where can I at least start to get involved and affect change, one of these, I'll give credit to you, John, for posting on social media about writing senators specifically referencing H.R. 8, the Background Checks Act of 2021. But writing your representatives is, of course, a standard response to try to gain some type of action on our behalf at the congressional level. There are two primary outfits or organizations that I found referenced that seem to be at the I'd say the general core of advocating for gun control. One is Everytown. I think the full name is Everytown for Gun Safety. It's relatively general, but it's everytown.org, and I'll of course make sure these links go in the show notes as well. The other organization is Giffords. It's go ahead.
I was going to say, does that have to do with the, was it a senator from Arizona?
Yes, Congresswoman from Arizona, Gabrielle Giffords.
Thank you.
I didn't catch what you said when I was
responding. I was just saying, thank you.
Okay.
For correcting.
I think similarly, it's like Giffords for America or something to that effect. But the website is giffords.org. Again, both links will go in the show notes. I did take the time to register with both personally. With Giffords, you could select whether you just wanted to be like kept in the loop on events, or if you would be willing to discuss things with others, or if you'd be willing to write an op-ed piece, that kind of thing. With Everytown, you can sign up for, getting information about events, newsletters, things of that nature. With Everytown, I just elected to donate as my course of action. We'll see what else I decide to do. I'm still kind of figuring out next steps. But I mean, come on. As a responsible gun owner, if I'm fed up with it, something is well beyond the point of needing to be changed. And if you want to argue that you shouldn't have regulation or some level of control around the weapons because the weapons themselves aren't the problem, then you have a completely illogical argument. If that were the case, we wouldn't have laws about anything, because obviously those things are not necessarily problematic. It's the behaviors of people that are problematic.
Oh, but it's more than like, at first it seemed like it was such a nice thing that there was so much discussion from Governor Abbott regarding mental health, but it was after, several minutes of mental health issues, lack of mental health care, inability to get mental health in this particular area of Texas, or difficulty getting it, or struggles with that. It became blaringly obvious that you're not going to say anything about gun control whatsoever. None whatsoever.
Oh yeah, for sure. And before I have another bite that of course I want to bring into it, but before we even go to that, and one of the things that I want to really just completely blatantly and explicitly state is that gun control in and of itself does not mean ban every possible type of firearm and that's it. Sure, that's a response. That's an extreme version of the response, and that's the type of response that anyone lobbying against gun control wants to leverage, because it creates a immediate emotional recoil effect from those people who their first instinct is to say, you can take my guns when you pry them from my cold, dead hands, which is also a problematic argument. Gun control simply means enacting measures to create responsibility and accountability for those people who choose to own firearms, and restricting access in some fashion, or restricting ease of access in some fashion, and making it ubiquitous. That's it. So if you want to fall on one extreme or the other, you're not here to actually care about the issue at hand. You're here to care about an opinion and lobbying for said opinion, and quite frankly, you can go away. We need to address the problem, and we need to do so appropriately and proportionately.
I used to be one of the folks who was like, ban the guns, and it was easy for me to say ban the guns because I don't own any firearms. I've never fired a firearm. But that's, that is an extreme. There is a Second Amendment, but I also believe we live in a country where it's like, I don't like the Second Amendment. We can write another amendment to do away with the Second Amendment. And if that's what we all wanted to do, that would be a course of action we could take. But I'm not even going to say that. We're in a place where it's just, it's too it's too easy to get a gun. And I've often heard, it's like, well, what about cars? They can kill people. And I was like, yeah, it's too easy to get a car too. So,
well, there are so many articles and studies from other places trying to quantify this notion of what it would actually mean if we were to apply similar measures used in other countries in the U.S. And we know that it's different. Right? There is not an equivacy between the environment of the United States and other countries for plenty of different reasons. But there are a number of things that are very clear based on actions and activities that have occurred in the United States. So banning assault rifle styled weapons actually did lead to a decrease in death and shooting rates, at least on the mass shooting scale. And people like to point out that the weapon's not a problem, or the weapon's not the problem, right? We demonize the AR-15, but we don't demonize other weapons that are capable of similar rates of fire and similar ammo capacities. And that's a fair argument if that was legitimately the argument, but that's not legitimately the argument. The weapon is pointed out because at a fundamental level, there is also a visual aesthetic that factors into the choice of weapon. You're not going to be intimidating coming in with a weapon that looks like an old, 22 that happens to be semi-automatic with a 12-round clip or 20-round clip. Take your pick. Whereas if you stroll up with an AR-15, people immediately equate that to a very dangerous weapon. For a person who is seeking that control and has behavioral and emotional issues surrounding that, the exuberance of power through the aesthetic is also part of the equation. Yes, banning that one weapon isn't going to make a difference, but banning that category of weapon does make a difference. And that's the part that people don't want to focus in on, because the talking points all reference like the AR-15 specifically. But the legislation does not. The legislation targets the category of weapon. Or did before it was revoked.
Well, it needs, that's where we need to go, and that's category, like the AR-15 style assault weapons. But that's not even, the biggest, in statistically, it's kind of a red herring. Yes, it's the one that makes the news because it's the one that does the most damage.
Let's rephrase that, because it's not the one that does the most damage. It's the one that most mass shooters gravitate toward.
Yes.
And there is a distinctive difference there. Because the same amount of damage could be done with 4 preloaded semi-automatic handguns. Like, all you would need to do is stroll up in a classroom with 2 Glocks and unload, and you would do the same amount of damage. No one is saying that you have to use an AR to do so, but an AR is going to give you, by default, I think 20-round clip. Maybe it's even 30. I don't remember for sure.
You can get a 30-round clip.
But I know you can also get like a 30-round clip for a Glock. It looks ridiculous, but still, it's a 30-round clip.
Yeah. So, the point I was going to make, though, is that, there's, if you want to have one of those, maybe that's okay, but maybe there's there's a lot more you have to do to qualify to get one of those.
Yeah, I think the big point that I want to make, and I'm not sure how, it's like when going back to when I started to talk about what gun control actually means. No one is saying that it has to go to the route of the ban either. What most of us, and us being people who do enjoy having access to firearms because they are fun for recreational use, what most of us legitimately want are some sort of licensing to have a firearm, which at least means that if in order for you to purchase it, you have to have some database where you are registered as a firearm owner, to require some level of gun safety training in conjunction with said licensure, and to have a background check universally every state in order for you to also get said license. Now, in the state of Alabama, if you have I think they call it a pistol permit, it's basically what allows you to do concealed carry. There is a background check. How detailed it is, I don't know. I mean, it's done through the sheriff's department, so I would hope it's detailed enough, right? But state of Georgia, I know, also requires a background check for a concealed carry permit. The difference being, I'm taking that a step further. Both states also require a background check at the time of purchase of a firearm from a distributor outside of a gun show. If you pay cash at a gun show, typically you can skirt that requirement. That's a problem.
It's a huge problem.
If it's normal for me to go somewhere and buy a weapon and have a background check in the state in which I live, extending it to a firearm show and ensuring that every firearm that is purchased by someone who is doing that same level of due diligence for the transaction should not be something to rail against. It's no different than if I drive up the road to a pawn shop and buy a gun today. They're required by law to do a background check. It's not a problem. It doesn't impact anything other than those people who would fail said background check. And quite frankly, if you would fail a background check, and I'm using fail, even though technically it's more, you would have something questionable and subsequently have to either explain it or whatever to a judge in order for a judge to sign off, that kind of thing. There's a legal path for it, right?
Right.
But the whole point being, if you would be a subject who would have a firearm purchase held up by the results of a background check or licensing of a permit held up by results of a background check, I fucking want you to have that hold up.
Right. Right.
I would hope it would happen to me.
Right.
Like, where's the problem in this scenario? And the whole problem is that instead of thinking through these steps rationally, people want to latch on to, they want to ban all guns. No, that's not the conversation. Sure, it could be a conversation. Other countries have taken that route. That's not something that's going to gain traction in the United States in the next 50 years at least, right? So, that's not even on the table at the moment. What's on the table is, let's evaluate what we can do to make access to firearms better in general.
I'll even argue that that's not even on the table right now. We don't even have on the table, we can't do any federal studies that says this is what happens when you wait this long. This is what kind of, this is how thorough this background check is. This is the sort of psych evaluation that you need to purchase this type of weapon. We don't have any of that.
One thing I want to mention real quick, now that you brought that up, because I saw an article and I forgot to bookmark it. But a couple of days ago, I saw reference to federal funding has actually now been freed to study firearm violence or gun violence as of the Biden administration.
Oh, well, this is a good step forward.
Right. I saw that. I thought of you immediately, and I forgot to bookmark it. So I will look for the link. I will try to find it and put it in the show notes, because I do think it's important to mention that we are finally at a point where Congress has said, yes, you can study gun violence.
Right. I mean, it took us almost 250 years.
Way too long.
225 years. Anyway.
I guess since that we're at a point where I can interject back and go back to my other bite. 30 minutes in. One tangentially related thing that I found of interest that I didn't realize was potentially an upcoming thing. Apparently, the Supreme Court is slated to rule on in a decision on a case involving New York and a 1913 law that basically, for all intents and purposes, outlaws concealed carry unless you have proper cause to be issued a concealed carry license. I will put the link in the show notes for this one. The case is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. And basically, the gist of the law states that you have to have a credible threat to your safety, and said threat cannot be mitigated in ways other than you being issued a concealed carry permit, and that's being challenged constitutionally.
Huh. That's a pretty strict law.
And it's also, depending on how it is. So the article I read mentions that it's going to be overturned or likely to be overturned. It's all a question of whether it just allows more guns or allows an overload of guns into the population. I didn't finish reading all the details, but the gist of it is there's really not an outcome with the current court where you can't see some relaxation of this law being forced based on oral arguments that were heard and some of the questions that were probed. The idea is just whether it would be flat out overturned or if it would be something where it would be forced to be relaxed on what proper cause could include. And the reason I say it that way is one of the questions specifically posed by, I don't remember which justice, I didn't make a note of it, but it was basically, why can't my justifiable cause be that I feel the desire to defend myself? Which is a really, really vague statement, and anybody can make that statement and supposedly meet the requirement if it's relaxed to that point, which is the whole gist of this article, that it thinks that's the path this is going to go.
Interesting. I added a little bite where you might not have been looking.
I saw it show up.
Yeah.
I was just refreshing to see if there was anything additional.
No. It was just I moved it around a little bit, but it was an interesting thing that I came across, and I don't know. So I'll say this is taken out of context, perhaps, of the entire law, but I'll just say that this bit of this measure and this legislation has, we'll say, just the optics are bad, and if any listener has wants to correctly put it in a different context, I'd love to get the feedback for this. But it is the optics are bad because it was a law that was passed by Governor Abbott in Texas. It's HB 496, and one of the measures in the law states that it requires all schools to have bleeding control kits. And that's interesting considering what's just happened. But I understand that kids hurt themselves, and it's you're gonna bleed. And I imagine that there's in a state as large as Texas that there could be some injuries that are really horrific that happen on the playground. I'm just, the first thing that comes to mind is maybe like a compound fracture. Anyway, but the optics are really bad when there is a measure. The first item in the bleeding control kit is, quote, tourniquets approved for use in battlefield trauma care by the Armed Forces of the United States, unquote.
Yeah, I'd say that's problematic in and of itself. Like leading up to that, right? Talking about a bleeding control kit, that all sounds okay.
It's a first aid kit. A first aid kit.
And you can imagine there's always potential for a more severe cut or break or something than what a Band-Aid or just, some gauze would handle.
Applying pressure to it is not going to be enough.
Yeah. So a bleeding control kit sounds fine.
Yes.
Until you read what has to be included in that kit, like you just did. Any reference to something included in schools that has to meet standards seen on a battlefield tells you there's a problem somewhere. Doesn't it? Or am I reading too much into the contextual verbiage or lack of contextual verbiage?
Like I said, the optics are bad. The other things that are included are chest seals, compression bandages, bleeding control bandages, space emergency blankets. That makes sense. Latex-free gloves, markers, scissors, and instructional documents, and so forth.
I guess you could also make the case that something that could be found to meet or exceed like battlefield care requirements could also be referencing, a knife wound of some sort, right? So a puncture wound.
Yeah.
Maybe not puncture, maybe more slashing. But you could, I guess, theoretically make the case that it's not trying to reference a battlefield type of response as much as it is the level of capabilities that would be addressed potentially on a battlefield short of mass casualty.
Like I said, the optics on this are really bad. There could be this could exist in a world where mass shootings at schools don't happen or happen almost never. But
right, and that's why I'm just trying to think through what else could it reference. Yeah.
But the point being is that's not the world we live in, and it's very easy to gravitate towards like, you knew this was coming, you know. You made a provision for this this exact kind of thing to happen.
So since we've circled back to Texas, I have a question. Something that has come out of the entire Uvalde situation is the police response and investigation into said response. And I'm not a law enforcement officer. Sure, I have some theoretical and educational background focused in on certain aspects of that, but I'm not going to pretend that I am an expert by any means. From a layman's perspective, I read about delays in response after initial confrontation and X amount of time, and I haven't even looked at all the details on the timeline. I've just kind of looked at the summaries of the takes. And I can think of two different scenarios that play out in my mind. One, the general thought that you wait for a tactical response unit to engage in some sort of situation that requires a tactical response, being something that could be, on the one hand, an explainer for why things seemed differently from the outside. But on the other hand, if the consistent argument is that all you need are more good people with guns to prevent a situation, then regardless of whether you generally would wait for a tactical response unit, wouldn't the general pull by your ideology and belief be to engage anyway? Like, orders be damned. And of course, that opens up multiple other segues, like the whole, if you break orders, are you prepared to suffer the ramifications and justifiable situations and everything else? Like, there are so many thoughts there. But what I want to focus more in on the question is, based on what we've learned about the response, just the response itself, not surrounding philosophical arguments, is it potentially misguided to think that maybe the official response was correct from a playbook standpoint, in that, whatever the read of the situation, it's a need for a specific type of resource to address said situation, and so that would explain the delay? Or is it something that is clearly an error? And trying to kind of pull back from, we obviously don't know what the details are for how the decisions were made. You're hearing responses to the decisions after the fact. But I wanted to get a general sense of, based on those stories, kind of what you thought, and that's going to lead into some follow-up discussion as well.
Well, it doesn't look good for the good guys with guns argument at all.
Doesn't look good for the law enforcement argument at all either, to be fair.
It looks worse for law enforcement. Like, there's a picture of Uvalde police officers with tactical gear from 2018 that's been floating around, and that did not age well.
So I would say it's clear to say that for all intents and purposes, everyone on the outside looking in views this as a botched response. I mean, I certainly do.
Yeah.
That being said, could some level of maybe law enforcement or incident response unification or uniformity also be a level of addressing this underlying situation in addition to restricting access to specific types of firearms? Which is where I'm kind of going with this is when we think about gun control, we always think about the access to and handling of the firearms themselves, right? Mm-hmm. But what about the other side of it? What about the response to a potential or confirmed active shooting incident? Is part of the gun control argument also uniformity in response through all the states, through all agencies, regardless of whether it's local PD or a tactical unit or what, having maybe more, in some cases, maybe more advanced training, in some cases, maybe training at all. You know, I certainly couldn't speak for the state of the different agencies, but how much of, when you think about gun control, comes into law enforcement response or other agency response, or has that even factored into your thought process at this point?
It really hasn't factored into my thought process, but it really goes well with a number of the issues that we're seeing with law enforcement, unrelated to shootings. But actually, maybe it is. It's we see problems where the law enforcement are responsible for the shootings, and so I'll always argue that there's law enforcement officers are not paid enough. Like anytime I see a job that's this critical, I look at it and I was like, they're probably not being paid enough, so they're not getting the best people. And that's not to say that, one bad apple doesn't make the whole the whole barrel rotten. But when the barrel doesn't do what the barrel is supposed to do, when the system isn't doing what the system's supposed to do, or there's systemic problems, then yes, you're going to have many rotten apples, too many. And so my imagery is out of control now. The higher paid a job is, the more you can expect of the person that's getting paid that much. And so I feel like, there's a lot more money that can be spent towards training and salaries of officers. Therefore, we could expect more and be able to, in conjunction with restricting access to firearms, both of those things will take this issue very far and resolve a lot of the problems that we are having.
So there are. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. It doesn't take a study to figure it out. It takes a study to figure out what's the best way of doing this.
So interestingly enough, and I kind of walked us into this statement because I do think it's something that should be emphasized as well in the scope of this debate, or scope of this not even debate, but more just exploration of the topic in general. Multiple studies have been done correlating education level of officers as a whole to different types of behaviors, both wanted and unwanted. And one of the things that has always been a positive trend in positive behaviors and incident escalation is the level of education of officers. And the problem with that is, generally speaking, the more educated an individual, the less likely they are to accept the starting salaries and everything of law enforcement, right? And so agencies will often reduce requirements. And so instead of a college degree, maybe they only require a high school diploma, in order to apply. And maybe the thought process is that you have to work X number of years in a correctional facility, and then maybe you make it to patrol, maybe you make it after that to some investigatory role. all of these things are cultural issues throughout departments. All of these things have been explored in some way, and there's plenty of literature on them. Where I'm going with all of this, though, is that a focus on education and on training always yields a better overall police response than in those areas where requirements are relaxed because they need to fill positions. It doesn't make sense to continue to focus on law enforcement as a panacea to a number of different things. Like it really, we're at a point where law enforcement needs to be very much focused on what it should be focused on as an agency, and not try to do 12 different jobs at once. And what I mean by that is it law enforcement, or is it crime prevention, or is it safety and traffic control and general pedestrian safety in certain areas? Like, we're asking police to do a lot of different things, including tactical response and hostage negotiation and all these other different subsets of things. That why is one agency tasked with that much? And yet most agencies require relatively little education before embarking on this path. There's a disconnect. And I'm not necessarily saying that you couldn't have a path for someone that has a high school diploma to go through and learn all of these things on the job. Right. I think that's absolutely something that should be investigated and defined for every agency ubiquitously.
Right, because you could create a career out of this,
Absolutely.
Like a career where you that doesn't require formal education, or what we look at as formal education beyond the high school diploma. There could be a whole curriculum about law enforcement and understanding the law. Because how many police officers don't understand the law? I hear plenty of stories about police officers not understanding the laws that they're trying to uphold.
Maybe a better way to phrase that, because I know what you're meaning, but I think part of it is they misinterpret actually the enforcement of the law versus not understanding the law, right? Or maybe it's both. But one of the things that I know I've heard often is, well, I have a right to request, like, search or ask information based on probable cause. And what does it mean to have probable cause? Well, you can say these phrases and you can understand the intent behind them, but when you actually dive into what probable cause entails, if I'm looking for a white man aged 50 plus, and I'm asking every male that I see a question related to something, well, that's not probable cause. That's being lazy, and that's misapplication and misinterpretation of what probable cause means. Sorry, I had to put the headphones back on after having to answer from the phone.
Oh, yeah. It sounds like you're back on the Mac.
Yeah. All right, so what was the last thing you heard?
Oh, you were talking about probable cause.
Oh. I don't remember exactly how far I got with it. Like, I was talking about the idea that if you are searching for a white suspect 50 plus and you're asking every male or just everybody in general, that's not actually the proper application and interpretation of probable cause. It's being lazy and thinking that the badge gives you the authority to ask everybody. And that's not the case.
Yep, you'd said that.
Okay. So you heard the whole thing then? Because after that, it was just, was that a good example, or do I need to come up with another example?
No, it was a good example. I didn't hear that part about, was it a good example? So
yeah.
I heard everything.
Well, that's the only thing you missed then.
All right.
But realistically, that's a big aspect of where law enforcement seems to fall short. It's either it's laziness, or it's not understanding how to properly apply the principles. And part of that is training. Part of it is the mentality of an individual who thinks that the authority of being an agent of said agency imparts upon them. And part of it is just not knowing better in general, which unfortunately can't be excused, because in that capacity, you should know better.
Yeah, we are doing ourselves, and we're doing our, we're all doing ourselves a disservice. And I can't help but expect that it's like there's somewhere someone is, there's a monetary gain to this, or it all falls back into the same stuff we talk about all the time. Here's the power structure as it is, and we don't want it to change. Here's how I'm benefiting from this monetarily or from power, and I don't want it to change. It all fits under that.
Yeah, there are certainly a lot of theories that I have there, predominantly based on a number of analyses of history of laws and legislation and unequal application of the criminal justice system across different groups. But I think that's a topic for another day. Back to, we've sort of diverted away from gun control. I know in general, both had a number of thoughts about it. Just pulling back to gun control as the topic in general, was there anything that we did not talk about that you wanted to bring forward or mention?
I feel like, with all the talk that there was about mental health, it's like, why isn't there a sort of psychiatric evaluation, that allows someone to get their, if you want to purchase a firearm, this is a mandatory requirement, more than just a background check, but like a full-on psychiatric evaluation that is related to owning a firearm, a specific one, like something that we studied. This is the best evaluation that we can do to determine whether someone is of right mind to own to be able to purchase a firearm, to own a firearm. And then on a regular basis, if you own firearms, every so often you have to go back for reevaluation. I think it's really important. And, I feel like a lot of people would say, oh, that's such an extreme measure. But it's like, yeah, their sole purpose of this tool is for killing. That's why it was invented. No, I don't expect I expect most people to not use it for that. But that's what that tool is for. And I understand, folks want to talk about various reasons why you would own a firearm, but at the end of the day, it's a really important thing. And why aren't we going to this extreme measure if we want to have access to these extreme tools?
So I've thought about that, and I still don't know for sure where I land on it, and this is why. I think the premise is absolutely fine, but in our history being just the history of the United States in general, we've seen a number of significant shortcomings when it comes to mental health and evaluations and recommendations in a broad sense, right? And I think that's where most of the hesitancy comes from, because you could absolutely have an actor in bad faith cause the entire system to crumble. And how do you address that first? Like, I think if, similar to like a medical board and everything else, I think if you had transparency and governing bodies that their sole purpose was to maintain as much objectivism and professional dispassionate objectivity and response and measurement.
Disinterested.
Not disinterested, dispassionate. Because as a psychological evaluation, you want them to be interested, but you don't want them to be persuaded by emotions or other non-objective
Yeah, you don't want them
criteria.
to be. You don't want whatever the outcome to be something that they care about. They're there to do to conduct do a thing.
Right. And I think up to this point, we've had such a miserable failure surrounding mental health that going from not having any type of psychological evaluation to proposing it seems preposterous. Because, I mean, after all, we are a country that still wants to sweep mental health under the rug. We don't want to acknowledge that it exists, much less treat it appropriately. And it's very easy to see in our current, framework, a scenario where someone has an episode of anxiety or depression. And what I mean by an episode of, suffers from an acute incident of some extreme or identifiable mental condition. And instead of it being identified as an acute case brought about by specific trauma, it's a broad classification that suddenly renders them unable to do certain things. There's a level of distrust there still. So I think the idea of getting to the point of psychological evaluations being a consistent part of firearm ownership is great. I think we have to address the underlying distrust and approach to mental health first before we try to apply it to anything. Like let's get mental health in and of itself in a good state and regulated and overseen and consistent. Then I think buy-in for requiring specific evaluations or at least assessments of state of mind would not be far-fetched.
That very much is putting the horse in front of the cart, but there's a necessity to start evaluating people's psychiatric state. There's a really important need for considering the mental well-being of a person who wants to own a deadly weapon. And so, as great as that would be and should be, and I wish we were in a place starting to address that or had already addressed it. I look at this and I can't help but wonder, it's like, if all these folks that would otherwise not be seeking any sort of mental health support start, the people at the top of the power structure are required to have access to mental health, I can't help but wonder how much and how far the mental health system in this country would advance.
So let's make sure we also clarify what I'm describing is my thought on why the buy-in's not there, not the lack of it being needed. Because if you step back from the specific requirements around like gun control and what that would look like, I have long emphasized that there's a need to address just general mental health across the board and treat it on the same level as physical health, just everywhere.
Well, dude, we're having a hard time getting that taken care of right now. In this
exactly. But the main thing that I want to emphasize, though, is that this is a huge part of the problem, but it's something that is it's not actually a gun control problem. It's a general population problem and needs to be addressed there first. And the only reason I say that is because the gun control subset of that argument, while it's important, if we address it as a public health concern, imagine how much more good that does than those people who seek legal acquisition of firearms first. Because in all honesty, while the majority of shootings do occur with people who purchased firearms legally, there are plenty of avenues to easily acquire firearms outside of regulatory oversight. We've already mentioned that that's a hole that needs to be looked at. But if we treat mental health as an aspect of public health and safety, everybody, whether you're interested in firearms or not now, is exposed to it. And so maybe in a year you suddenly have a depressive bent and you're focused on death and destruction for whatever reason. Angry white male becomes, hits puberty type scenario, or hits adulthood or whatever. Like, take your pick. The point being, if you address it as a gun control issue, you're targeting a subset of the population. If you address it as a public health issue, you're targeting the entire population. All I'm really saying at the end of the day is that we need to approach the entire population first, and then we can make it even more pronounced for that subset of the population once we get the big picture under control.
Mm-hmm. Again,
the proper method may very well be the reverse. Maybe it's proper to focus on the subset and really enforce a stricter version of it on that subset of the population and then expand it to the population at large. I certainly don't know which way would be better, but my general feelings on the matter are, let's make it something that applies to everybody, and let's make this be a conversation that's a part of daily life because it's important. And plenty of people who aren't pursuing firearms are also suffering from mental issues.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to identify. But also, I think also with such a big problem, there doesn't have to be one path forward. The solutions can be addressed in many different ways by many different people. Honestly, I gotta say, I really appreciate the topic because, we focus on restricting access to guns when something like this happens. And while that is important, there's multiple issues that need to be addressed for the overall problem that we see in this country. And, there's not a silver bullet that solves the problem.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'm often reminded of that seems like it would be a good point to really call to attention here. No social problem has a single answer. None. No matter how much we want it to, it just doesn't exist. There are too many variables at play when you talk about social constructs. And so mental health is a problem. Access to specific weaponry at certain points in life or with certain amounts of ease or without some level of due diligence or responsibility. All of those things are aspects of the problem. We've talked through most of them. But one thing that, as we're talking, and you mentioning or reminding that multiple things could be implemented at one time, the one thing that I think would be met with fierce resistance, and this is kind of the core of why I approached the argument the way I did, is if you go from 50 states having 50 different levels of requirements on firearm acquisition and whether you can carry with or without a permit and everything else, and you go to at least requiring a permit and also requiring some level of registration and background check and requiring a psychological evaluation, it seems like you go from nothing to an extreme version of a response. And so kind of what I'm really getting at is, all right, we need to get to a point where the psychological evaluation is part of this process, but maybe the first step is really focusing on the public health or the mental health from the public sphere perspective for the first year. And then in another year, add on that requirement to licensure. So maybe the first step on the gun control side is you have to have a license to have a firearm. Just get things registered. Maybe that's the first step, that and a cursory background check. But then it doesn't seem like it's an extreme response to say, all right, we've been talking about mental health as something that everybody needs to address. Let's add to the licensing process this psychological eval. And then in a couple of years, maybe you add a recurring every 5 year, every renewal, whatever the case may be, have another evaluation. The entire point that I was making was just that my view on it is that if you try to go for that now, even though it's needed, even though I 100% agree with the idea, I feel like that would be met with fierce resistance, as opposed to targeting the same issue from a different perspective before you make it a part of the response in a year or two.
I don't know. I think it's, how do you market this? Like, what if this is marketed as, oh, hey, you know what? You want to own a military-style weapon? You got to have a military-style psychiatric evaluation, because they do that already. Maybe it's, I don't know what the quality of that, psychiatric evaluations in the military are. Maybe good, maybe bad. Maybe it depends on the doctor involved. But they do it already. I don't know why, we couldn't, start with that one and maybe find out, go to a place where, okay, we can do better than this. I don't know. But, it does exist. It has been worked on for quite some time.
That's a fair point. And I think the biggest thing here, well, I mean, realistically, this part of the conversation is more a matter of just trying to say something has to be done. We acknowledge something has to be done. We're well beyond the point of something should have been done.
Yes.
A complete and utter failure on our parts across the board to not have some meaningful action taken on this topic already, right? And so we certainly own that, we being the collective voting age American, or obviously older. But it's interesting to talk through how do you apply it, because one, neither one of us are in a position to do so, right? Like this is all theoretical spitballing how it might be best received. But it's interesting to think about the perspectives at play, because we're a very small subset of the general population. Won't even try to get into the math, but if you're trying to keep score at home, 2 people out of however many billion, pretty small subset of the population,
right? And if we can come up with these decent ideas on, like, here's how we start working on the problem. Just think about who already knows, is in a much better place to say, this is where we start right here, and this is where we start over there. Those people exist. They're just not.
And I want to take it a step further. Like, I personally have only been thinking about this for a couple of weeks.
Right.
If I can get to this point in a couple of weeks, why is it taking us this long to do anything other than send thoughts and prayers?
It goes back to the corruption, but that's where it always goes. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after-show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.